Azazello's Cream. The full moon hung in the clear evening sky, visible through the branches of the maple tree. The lindens and acacias traced an intricate pattern of spots on the garden floor. The triple casement bay window, wide open but with blinds drawn, shone with a harsh electric light. The lights in Margarita Nikolaevna's bedroom were all turned on, revealing a state of total chaos. Chemises, stockings, and underwear were lying on the blanket on top of the bed, and other undergarments were strewn on the floor, along with a pack of cigarettes that had gotten crushed in the excitement. There were slippers on the night table next to an unfinished cup of coffee and an ashtray that held a smoking cigarette butt. A black evening gown hung on the back of a chair. The room smelled of perfume, and from somewhere came the smell of a red-hot iron. Margarita Nikolaevna was sitting before her mirror in a bathrobe which had been thrown over her naked body and black suede shoes. In front of her lay a gold watch, and next to it the small jar she had received from Azazello. Margarita's eyes were glued to the watch. At times it seemed to her as if the watch were broken and the hands weren't moving. But they were moving, albeit very slowly, as if they kept getting stuck, and finally the big hand hit 29 minutes after 9. Margarita's heart gave such a terrible thump that at first she couldn't even pick up the jar. When she pulled herself together and opened the jar, she saw that it contained a greasy, yellowish cream, which seemed to smell of swamp mud. With the tip of her finger, Margarita scooped up a small glob of the cream and put it in her palm, which made the swampy, woodland smell more noticeable. She then began rubbing the cream into her cheeks and forehead. The cream spread easily and seemed to be absorbed immediately. After several applications of the cream, Margarita looked in the mirror and dropped the jar on the face of her watch, cracking the crystal. She closed her eyes, took another look, and burst into wild laughter. Her eyebrows, which had been plucked thread thin at the ends, had thickened and now arched evenly over her eyes, which had become green. There was no longer any trace of the tiny vertical line on the bridge of her nose, which had first appeared back in October when the master disappeared. Gone, too, were the yellowish shadows around her temples and the barely noticeable crow's feet at the outer corners of her eyes. Her cheeks were suffused with a rosy blush, her forehead had become clear and white, and her hair salon permanent wave had loosened. There in the mirror, staring back at 30-year-old Margarita, was a 20-year-old woman with naturally curly black hair, showing her teeth and laughing unrestrainedly. Having laughed her fill, Margarita swept off her robe, scooped up a generous glob of the light, greasy cream, and began rubbing it vigorously all over her body, which immediately became rosy and began to glow. Then the throbbing in her temple, which had been bothering her all evening ever since her meeting with Azazello in Alexandrovsky Park, disappeared in a flash as if a needle had been removed from her brain. The muscles in her arms and legs got stronger, and then Margarita's body became weightless. She gave a little jump and stayed suspended in the air just above the carpet. Then she felt a slow downward pull and was back on the ground. "Oh, what a cream, what a cream!" cried Margarita, throwing herself into an armchair. The cream had transformed more than her appearance. Now her whole body, every part of it, surged with joy, and she felt as if tiny bubbles were prickling her all over. Margarita felt free of everything. In addition, she realized with utter clarity that her premonition of the morning had come true, and she was leaving her house and her former life forever. But one thought from that former life still persisted, namely that there was one last thing she had to do before embarking on the new and extraordinary something that was pulling her upwards into the air. So naked as she was, flying intermittently, she ran out of the bedroom into her husband's study, turned on the lights, and rushed to the desk. On a sheet of paper, torn off a pad, she wrote in pencil, quickly and boldly and without any corrections, the following note: "Forgive me and forget me as quickly as you can. I'm leaving you forever. Don't try to find me. It's useless. I've become a witch because of the grief and the misfortunes that have befallen me. It is time for me to go. Farewell, Margarita." Her soul relieved of every care, Margarita flew back into her bedroom, and Natasha ran in after her, loaded down with all sorts of things. And suddenly everything, a dress on a wooden hanger, lace shawls, dark blue silk shoes on shoe trees, and a belt, fell to the floor, and Natasha clasped her now free hands. "Well, do I look good?" cried Margarita loudly in a husky voice. "How did it happen?" whispered Natasha, reeling backwards. "How did you do it, Margarita Nikolaevna? It's the cream, the cream, the cream, replied Margarita, pointing to the gleaming gold jar and doing a turn in front of the mirror. Forgetting about the crumpled dress on the floor, Natasha ran over to the mirror and stared with voracious, burning eyes at what was left of the cream. Her lips whispered something. She turned again to Margarita and said with a kind of reverence, "What skin, what skin? Why, Margarita Nikolaevna, your skin is glowing." But then she remembered herself, ran over and picked up the dress, and began smoothing it out. Put it down, Margarita shouted at her. "The devil with it. Throw everything out, or rather, keep it as a memento, to remember me by. You can take everything in the room." Natasha stood for a while as if in a daze, staring at Margarita. Then she fell on her neck, kissing her and shouting, "Like satin, it glows like satin, and your eyebrows, what eyebrows?" "Take all this stuff, and the perfume too, and put it in your trunk and hide it," shouted Margarita. "But don't take the jewelry, or they'll accuse you of stealing." Natasha put whatever came to hand into a bundle, dresses, shoes, stockings, and underwear, and ran out of the bedroom. Just then the sounds of a virtuoso waltz came blaring through an open window across the street, and a car was heard spluttering as it pulled up to the gates. "Azazello will call any minute," exclaimed Margarita, listening to the waltz streaming in from outside. "Yes, he will. And the foreigner is harmless. Yes, I can see that now. He's harmless." The car roared and pulled away from the gates. The gate banged and steps were heard coming down the path. "That's Nikolai Ivanovich. I can tell by his footsteps," thought Margarita. "I'll have to do something interesting and amusing as a way of saying goodbye." Margarita pulled the shade aside and sat sideways on the windowsill, her hands clasped on her knee. The moonlight caressed her right side. Margarita raised her head toward the moon and assumed a pensive and poetic expression. Footsteps were heard once or twice again, and then they suddenly stopped. After admiring the moon a little longer, Margarita sighed for the sake of appearances, and turned to look down at the garden, where she did, in fact, see Nikolai Ivanovich, who lived on the floor below her. Bathed in bright moonlight, he was sitting on a bench, and it was obvious that he had sat down suddenly. His pince-nez was askew, and he was clutching his briefcase to his chest. "Well, hello, Nikolai Ivanovich," said Margarita in a sad voice. "Good evening. Have you come from a meeting?" Nikolai Ivanovich made no reply. "I, as you can see," Margarita continued, leaning further out into the garden, "have been sitting here alone, bored, looking at the moon, and listening to the waltz." Margarita passed her left hand across her forehead, adjusting a stray curl, then said angrily, "That's not polite, Nikolai Ivanovich. I am a lady after all. It's rude not to answer when someone is talking to you." Nikolai Ivanovich, visible in the moonlight down to the last button on his gray waistcoat, the last hair on his blonde goatee, suddenly grinned a wild grin, got up from the bench, and obviously beside himself with embarrassment, did not remove his hat as one would have expected, but rather waved his briefcase to the side and got into a crouching position, as if he were about to do a Russian dance. "Oh, what a bore you are, Nikolai Ivanovich," continued Margarita. "I can't tell you how sick and tired I am of all of you, and how happy I am to be leaving you. To the devil's mother with all of you." Just then Margarita heard the phone ring in the bedroom behind her. She jumped off the windowsill and, forgetting about Nikolai Ivanovich, grabbed the receiver. "It's Azazello," said the voice in her ear. "Dear, dear Azazello," exclaimed Margarita. "It's time to fly away," said Azazello. And it was clear from his tone that he was pleased with Margarita's genuine display of joy. "When you fly over the gates, shout, 'I'm invisible,' then fly around over the city for a while to get used to it. And after that, head south, away from the city, and go straight to the river. They're expecting you." Margarita hung up the phone, at which point something wooden-sounding started bumping around in the next room and began knocking at the door. Margarita opened the door, and in flew a dancing broom, brush end up. It tapped a few beats on the floor with its handle, gave a kick, and strained toward the window. Margarita squealed with delight and jumped astride the broomstick. Only then did she remember that in all the confusion she had forgotten to get dressed. She galloped over to the bed and grabbed the first thing she saw, a light blue chemise. Waving it like a banner, she flew out the window, and the sound of the waltz over the garden intensified. Margarita slipped down from the window and saw Nikolai Ivanovich on the bench. He seemed to be frozen to it and was listening in a stupefied state to the banging and shouting coming from the lighted bedroom of his upstairs neighbors. Farewell, Nikolai Ivanovitch, cried Margarita, dancing about in front of him. He groaned and began edging down the bench, feeling his way with his hands and knocking his briefcase to the ground. Goodbye forever, I'm flying away, shouted Margarita, drowning out the waltz. She then decided that she had no need of the chemise, and with an ominous chuckle she threw it over Nikolai Ivanovitch's head. Blinded, he tumbled off the bench onto the bricks of the path. Margarita turned to take one last look at the house where she had suffered so long, and in the lighted window she saw Natasha gaping with astonishment. Farewell, Natasha, Margarita shouted and urged her broom upward. Invisible, I'm invisible, she shouted. Even more loudly, and with the branches of the maple tree brushing against her face, she flew out over the gates and into the street. And the totally crazed waltz followed her aloft.